Today's video will explain the noun identification process. Hello, I'm James Helfrich. Often it is difficult to turn user requirements into actual functioning code. In fact, the biggest challenge often is to identify what program entities are related to a given requirement. Well, we have a methodology to solve this problem. It's called noun identification. This is the process of looking for parts of speech in a requirement and mapping those to actual program entities. This video will explain that process. So noun identification is the process of carefully combing through client-provided requirements to discover programming entities. For an example, here's a requirement. A player deals a card from the deck when it is her turn. So let's take a look at this requirement here, and we're going to see if we can tease out some entities. First of all, the player is a proper noun. A proper noun refers to a specific player. It's one and a type of player, which in a type of player would be a common noun, but this is a specific one. Then we have deals, and deals is an action verb. So this is going to map to a function or a method. I'm going to perform an action. And then a card, it could be any card. I'm not referring to a specific card, and a card is a common noun. And then we have the deck, a specific deck. And so that specific deck is going to be a proper noun, and it's going to be a variable or an object. And then it is her turn, and that her turn is a common noun. A turn is something we're going to have to represent, and this is probably going to be a class or something like that. So let's take a look at the different parts of speech. So a common noun is usually a class, like a deck of playing cards. There could be many decks, and it's not a specific deck, but a deck is a common noun, it's a class. And then we have a proper noun, and that's an object. This is a specific item. For an example, Bob's poker hand. And so this is not going to be any poker hand, this is a specific one, and this is going to be a variable. An adjective is usually a member variable. This card is a spade. So a card would be a common noun or a class. It's going to have an attribute called a spade. An action verb is a function or method, dealing a playing card, quitting the program, saving a file. These are normally functions or methods. A having verb is going to be composition or aggregation, a class in a class. So a deck has a playing card. And then a being verb is inheritance. A hand is a type of deck. So we're going to look for these types of parts of speech in our requirements. So let's take a look at these in more detail. First of all, a common noun. A noun is a person, place, or thing. Common nouns represent types of things, where proper nouns represents an instance of a thing. So here's a couple of best practices. First of all, before settling on a data type, enumerate the possibilities. So we want to see what different options we have to represent this common noun. Longevity benefits from formality. If this particular common noun is going to be used many times, then don't use a generic data structure like a tuple or an array, then instead create a class for it. Only use a class when there is no better alternative. In other words, if we already have a construct which does basically what we want, we don't want to create yet another program entity if it's going to just add complication to the application. Classes represent things that are not collection of verbs. In other words, I'm not going to bundle up a whole bunch of verbs and call it a class, because then I'm not going to have any member variables. And class fundamentally are about nouns. If we have a class without attributes, without member variables, then we're going to have a fidelity problem. In other words, it doesn't represent anything. Next, an adjective is a word describing a noun. They are usually an attribute in a class, but they're sometimes a value for a noun. So here's a few best practices. When an implied noun is discovered, make it explicit. In other words, sometimes when we speak in English, we tend to be a little informal and imprecise. And now it's usually a good idea to repeat back that requirement or elaborate on that specific sentence by making that attribute or that adjective explicit. So now it can map more closely to a program entity. Enumerate the alternatives. So for an example, if I'm going to say a playing card is a spade, well, what are the other alternatives? Well, it could be a heart, or it could be a club. So now I'm going to have all the different possible values for my adjective, and that's going to help me define that adjective better. If an adjective can be changed, discover how. For an example, I can have a hand for a playing card. What kind of actions will I do it? Will I sort it? Will I organize it? Will I add things to it, remove things from it? Will I display it? Will I hide it? I need to understand how it can be discovered. So I'm going to ask for a clarification to the product owner about this particular adjective to see what its life cycle is, how it moves. A verb is a used word to describe an action or state, and action verbs most often correspond to functions or methods. And this is the hard part. They're often implied in a sentence, requiring a bit of work to discover them. So here's a few best practices. Ask cohesion questions for every action verb, because remember, that action verb is going to turn into a function or a method. And therefore, since it's a function or method, we got to know, what does it stand for? I want it to do one thing and one thing only. What exactly is that thing? I want to think about cohesion early in the design process, and the discovery of that function is a good place to start. Identify all the proper nouns and common nouns associated with every action verb. And these proper nouns and common nouns are going to be the parameters in and the return values out to that function. Methods can be distinguished from functions when there is a strongly associated noun. For an example, let's say that I have the distance formula where I want to update the position of an element based on its current position, its velocity, and acceleration. Now, I can imagine just making a function called update position, but well, update what position? That's a noun. So since it's strongly associated with a noun, I'm thinking to myself that should be a method rather than a standalone function. While doing verbs describe actions, having verbs describe containment. And there are 5 different types of relations. We have composition, aggregation, nested class, association, and dependency. Now, just from having a having verb in a requirement does not mean we know which flavor it is. So we got to ask some follow-on questions. For an example, with composition, do I create and destroy that associated noun? And if the answer is yes, then it's composition. But if I do not create and destroy it, it's probably aggregation. Does an other associated noun make sense in any other context? If the answer is no, I'm probably going to use nested. So these are the kinds of questions I got to ask so I can determine what relationship is appropriate just because I have a having verb. Now, being verbs are usually characterized by the phrase is a. They clarify the type or nature of something. For an example, a mother is a woman is a person is a mammal. So we have the is a going on here. So this is going to be inheritance. And so I'm going to have a mammal is my base class, person is a derived class, woman is a derived class, and mother is a derived class from that. And so I have this whole chain is derived just from a single sentence through the is a keyword. Now we can learn more about the noun identification process in the noun identification chapter of the software design textbook.